Time now for Back Pages tonight here on Sky Sports News, bringing you a first look at the sports stories in the morning's newspapers. Joining us tonight are Martyn Ziegler from the Times and the Independent's Miguel Delaney. Welcome to you both. We'll hear from them in just a little while. First, let's run you through the Back Pages. The Metro leads with Liverpool's contract talks with Virgil van Dijk and a rallying call from Mikel Arteta after their defeat to Bournemouth on Saturday. The Eye references Mikel Arteta's comments about Arsenal's red cards derailing any title challenge, and a picture of Chris Wood, whose goal gave Nottingham Forest their first home win of the season. The Guardian also cover Arteta's comments, as well as a feature interview with Alexander Zinchenko and female players demanding FIFA scrap Saudi sponsorship. The Express splash with Arteta's fears regarding Arsenal's red card record, plus could Xabi Alonso succeed Pep Guardiola at Manchester City? The Telegraph report on tomorrow's emergency Premier League meeting to discuss the next steps after last week's APT judgments. While the Sun report the FA have launched a probe into Gary O'Neal's comments following Sunday's late defeat to Manchester City. All right, great to be chatting to both of you. We're going to start with this Virgil van Dijk story and how important for Liverpool, Martyn, if we get your comment first, to wrap up this contract talks which Van Dijk has now admitted are ongoing quickly.
Yeah, I mean, he's 33, so no spring chicken, but I don't think his form has suffered at all any signs of his age. In fact, he's as strong as he ever was. Very difficult to replace. I'm sure they want to keep him. But he said, he doesn't know if he's going to be at Liverpool next season. That will cause some consternation for Liverpool fans. And he's not the only one, is it? I think that Mo Salah, his contract's up at the end of the season. Trent Alexander-Arnold. So there's a lot of work to do for the director of football at Liverpool to try and sew up those deals and get some stability in place.
Yeah, Miguel, just to follow on, as Martyn mentioned, there are three major stars for Liverpool, both out of contract, coming up at the end of this season. As you mentioned, Martyn, Salah, there's that Van Dijk who we're talking about, and Trent Alexander-Arnold. Those are some big names.
Yeah, it's been the issue, I suppose, the one maybe negative hanging over Liverpool's near perfect start to the season. And I suppose some of that almost becomes a little bit of a referendum on Slot himself. I mean, certainly, so let's say with Alexander-Arnold's situation, even some of the words that Van Dijk has spoken about in the past and what he's alluded to. But there's a sense of, given that Klopp had gone, and it is such a major change for a club, for a player, they want to see what next. So they wanted to see how it went in their Slot. So if contract talks have started on the back of that, that in itself is an endorsement of what Slot has done so far. It is early days, of course. We're into a period of the season now where I suppose we're going to find out the real Liverpool to some extent because of how difficult their fixture list is. But, I mean, he can only play what's in front of him so far. And it's been, I suppose, as far as that one result to Forest, which now looks so forgivable in wider context, it's almost as well as he could have hoped for. And that will, of course, encourage a positive momentum and potentially players now thinking, well, hang on, there might be... Maybe it isn't like at other clubs who've lost a big transformational figure like Klopp. Maybe it doesn't need to be like that, and Liverpool can continue on steadily. But yeah, obviously that continuity will be helped by names like this having more certainty about their future.
Okay, we're going to move on to the Arteta story, which dominates many of the back pages, and starting with the Express back, which says Arteta on red alert, and the subheading here: Mikel fears poor discipline could wreck title bid. That is a very valid fear for you, Martyn?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's obvious in some ways, isn't it, that they've had 3 red cards and it's been very, very costly for their title charge already. So I think Arteta's just saying what everybody feels, that this can't go on, and if there is more bad discipline, and whether or not Arsenal think that some of those red cards were harsh or not, the fact is they can't afford to take those chances. So they need to get that discipline really, really tight if they're going to have any chance of challenging City, Manchester City, Liverpool for that title. They can't afford these sort of slip-ups.
Yeah, and then the back page says red cards will make title hopes impossible. I think the question really is, Miguel, having dropped points in all 3 matches where they've had players sent off, is this a problem that Arteta's kind of recognizing a little bit too late on?
Well, I do have a small bit of sympathy for Arsenal. People will look at that record and think, they've got to improve their discipline. I did think the one at the weekend was probably a red. The previous 2, I've got more sympathy for Arsenal, particularly when we've seen famous cases now, or maybe infamous cases, of similar incidents in other games that didn't result in that. But while I do have sympathy for Arsenal, I think this is one of the issues where, obviously there's been a lot of noise around the club in terms of decisions and even referees. You have to look at the Newcastle decision last season and the statement after that. And one of the issues that can happen there is that it can almost even subconsciously create a fixation, create a noise when it comes to decision. I'm not saying that referees go out to intentionally kind of, that a club will be marked for them. But when there's all this discussion around clubs, I suppose it creates more flashpoints in games. And you only have to see the way some Arsenal players and Arsenal figures have reacted. And it does just feel, in relation to kind of the way their games are officiated, there's just this constant atmosphere in Arsenal. It's probably something that you just have to address. And otherwise, because of all this, and because of almost the psychological effect of it, it can start to become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and interesting you're saying they need to address it, because the back page of The Guardian says Arteta admits discipline issue, but he won't discuss it with his players. Miguel, he says the most effective way, I have to be honest, is not talking about it.
Yeah, and I suppose that's where maybe it comes up as well, in terms of the more you talk about it, the more there's potential for dissent in games. The more bookings come, the more you can suddenly get a second booking for something innocuous, as has happened in 2 of Arsenal's games. And I suppose that's what Arteta has to look at. But then, of course, we have to remember as well that there's a difference between what managers say in public in these situations and what they'll necessarily say in private, because they do want to create a siege mentality while they, or they don't want to give anyone an in from the outside while making sure things are corrected on the inside.
OK, we're going to move on now to the back page of The Telegraph, because there's a story about Tom Morgan and Ben Rumsby about City facing off with rivals at emergency meeting. Manchester City facing their rivals in the Premier League civil war as the outcome of their associated party arbitration is thrashed out between clubs for the first time. Martin, you've got to explain this to me.
Yeah, so this is the sort of famous associated party legal challenge that Manchester City took out against the Premier League and achieved some success, not total success, but certainly some, which has caused the Premier League to have to relook at these rules about deals between related parties. There was supposed to be a meeting last Thursday, that got postponed, and now there's going to be a call tomorrow from all the Premier League clubs. They're not meeting in person. I think this is going to be the first one to try and thrash out what they're going to do about the outcome of this legal challenge, how they move forward, how they get the amend the rules that the 3-man independent commission said that they're going to have to change. So I think this is the start of a process. I'll be very surprised if there's any decisions come out tomorrow. But the Premier League know they're going to have to make some changes, and it's just how easy that is going to be.
Yeah, there's a line in here that says City's legal chief emailed the other 19 clubs to urge against a knee-jerk reaction that would likely lead to further legal proceedings with further legal costs. What do you think the mood in some club boardrooms will be, Miguel?
I think it probably helps that they actually have this meeting after a weekend of football, because, I've written about this myself. Martin's obviously written about it a lot. But after that email, which referenced the legal action, and going into what was supposed to be the meeting on Thursday, from everything I heard, tensions were extremely high. There was even talk in the Premier League about how that email, other clubs saw it as an act of war. Then some clubs, purely because of their own self-interest, are actually uncertain at the moment about what their stance will be on this issue they have to address, particularly on shareholder loans, which creates a potential governance problem for the Premier League. So given all that, it probably does actually help that they've had a bit more time to reflect. We know the reason that the meeting was delayed, because the Premier League wanted to collate more info. And even then, despite the fact, I suppose, when news came out that the meeting was leaked, I think everyone saw it in terms of a real negative. The Premier League were stressing at the time it was just a temporary delay. It was going to be a matter of days, which it has been. And that will probably help the mood slightly. I suppose when some clubs met last week for the European Club Association meeting, where City's Ferran Soriano is a board member, it was relatively cordial towards him, although there's still fury among other clubs about that email. So I think it'll be tense, but maybe not quite as tense as it could have been on Thursday.
All right, we are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll look at more of the back pages, including this in the Express. Alonso on City radar. You're watching Back Pages tonight, and welcome back to Martyn Ziegler from the Times and the Independent's Miguel Delaney. We're going to the back page of the Eye that has a picture of Chris Wood scoring the only goal tonight as Nottingham Forest beat Crystal Palace in Monday Night Football. Would you believe it? Kiwi striker leaves Henderson in despair with Forest winner. Miguel, let's start with you. Just how big a victory for Forest tonight?
Huge. And I suppose in terms of how it kind of it's stable, well, not just stabilised, maybe the wrong word, but they've had quite a strong start to the season, I think. I mean, given previous market activity at Forest, how many players they've signed, given maybe the noise around the ownership, it always feels like there's the potential for, I suppose, chaos to engulf the club. Whereas Nuno, to be fair to him, I think has been very good so far at just imposing order on Forest. And I suppose that's one way to describe his football as well. But it's been visible in performances, and now it's visible in results. And I think this is just another game that kind of sets them on quite, competent path of the season.
Yeah, they're up to 8th now, level on points with 7th place Tottenham. Further down the table is where Crystal Palace find themselves, still looking for their first victory after 8 matches now, just 3 points. It's a very different start to the season than many expected from Oliver Glasner's side, given what they did at the back end of last season. Were you one of those? Are you one of those, Martin, who's surprised by how they've started?
Yeah, because Glasner came in and did so well, didn't he, when he came in last season? So I think me and a lot of others were probably expecting a much stronger start. Having said that, I think they've been on the wrong end of quite a few marginal defeats as well. So it just isn't quite clicking. But, I mean, they've got strong players there. They managed to keep Mark Gahey, very important player for him. So I actually thought once they'd kept him, that would allow them to have a stable base to progress and get some decent results. It hasn't quite happened yet, but I don't think we should write them off quite yet.
Yeah, question to both of you, and you can kick us off, Martin. Is Oliver Glasner under pressure? And how much pressure is he under?
I don't think he's under any immediate pressure. Just because of what he achieved last season. So I think they will certainly give him time, not panic. I think there's been a story in the European press that Bayern Munich were desperate to get him at the end of last season. So if that's the case, maybe Crystal Palace will realise that they may well be onto a good thing and give him as much time as he needs.
Do you agree, Miguel?
Yeah, I think Palace are quite a sensible club, so wouldn't rush in that sense. You know, if you look at last season, actually, before Glasner went, they tend to allow their managers space and are understanding, although not overly understanding. But at the moment, I think there's a clear issue with Palace, which is, I suppose, adjusting to the sale of one of their major attackers last season in Elise. It has maybe taken away some of their firepower. I've been at one of their games when they drew at Manchester United. I've watched them a fair bit, and you can see a lot of the team is actually right. Bar just when it gets to that final third. I wouldn't have major concerns about them. I think they will get it right. But I suppose it is one of those situations where you don't want bad results to start to fester into kind of a confidence loss and that negative momentum. But I think Glasner, as Martin said there, is a capable enough manager to address that.
Yeah, well, Martin's talked about a Bundesliga club eyeing a Premier League manager potentially. What about the other way around? Because in the Mirror, they've got City's X factor if Pep leaves. Jeremy Cross says Manchester City bosses will target Xabi Alonso if Pep Guardiola decides to leave the Etihad this summer. What do you make of the story, Martin?
Well, I mean, Xabi Alonso is going to be the most in-demand manager in Europe, I guess. If Pep goes, then of course Manchester City will look at him. I think any top club will be keeping a very close eye on what happens with Javier Alonso, because what he achieved with Bayer Leverkusen was just incredible. Why wouldn't the best clubs in the world be keeping tabs on him? And if he becomes available, and if Pep Guardiola leaves, I'm sure he will be right up there.
Yeah, on the back page of the Express as well, Alonso on City radar. We're already talking replacements, Miguel. Do we think Pep's definitely leaving?
I think he hasn't made up his mind yet. It does feel like a bit of the mood is actually it might be shifting towards Guardiola extending. That's being said more and more. But of course, the great unknown in all this is what's going to happen with the Manchester City hearing. The club, of course, insists on their innocence. But if they are found guilty of some of the charges and get severe penalties, and that completely changes the context for what the manager, what the entire manager situation will be for both Guardiola and potential successors. But of course, for the moment, the club can have to just persist business as usual. And the mood at the moment seems to be very much waiting for whatever Guardiola wants to do, given he has been the most important football figure at the club for the last decade.
So moving on to the Times now. Martin, you're going to lead us here. Your colleague Gary Jacob writes, Arsenal eye ground expansion. Can you elaborate on the story?
Yeah, Arsenal, 20 years on from building their new stadium, which has been a sort of cash generator for them. Now looking up the road to Tottenham Hotspur and just realising actually they're falling behind in the amount of money that this stadium generates. So I think Tottenham, they generate more than £6 million every home match. Arsenal is probably closer to 4 million. So there is a gap there. And so Arsenal are looking at ways, how can they expand the Emirates, increase the capacity, get more people in, perhaps more, hospitality boxes, because that is one way in which they can try and get back onto an equal footing financially.
Is this going to become more commonplace, Miguel, do you think, especially with FFP and other regulations?
I think it's very interesting. I was at the Leaders in Sport conference last week, which obviously a lot of it is actually about investment in football, finance, the commercial side. And a bit of a theme of it was basically that a lot of, say, the income that has defined the last 20 years of football, which is basically global expansion, multimedia, not that it's kind of basically that market is at a mature point, and where an increasing number of clubs are seeing the opportunity for more revenue is in their stadium, in hosting events, in hospitality and corporate. I think there's an issue for fans there, in that I'd be worried maybe about how many clubs are thinking about upping season ticket prices, or even potentially bringing in more one-off tickets to attract or to kind of capitalise on the Premier League's immense international popularity, which I think would be a very negative move for the sport to go that way. But yes, increasingly a number of clubs see stadiums as maybe their main revenue generator. And there's a bit of an irony there, given that when this stadium was built and completed for 2006, it was one of those cases where it was almost built at exactly the wrong time, because that was just at the point where a lot of new money started to come into the sport. Obviously, Abramovich was the big one in taking over Chelsea. Suddenly, basically, almost changed Arsenal's plans overnight. And then, of course, the City takeover 2 years after that. And now that might have come full circle again, to the point Arsenal can think about making the stadium bigger, because it's where the main money is.
We're going to move on now to The Sun, because the back page there says ONeal in bias probe. It's obviously Gary O'Neill's comments about the referees having subconscious bias to the Prem's big clubs, and they've been contacted to explain the post-match comments. Martin, what did you make of those comments? Were they self-explanatory? Were you surprised that there's a further probe into it now?
I'm slightly surprised that the FA have become involved, and I mean they've just asked him for his feedback, his comments on what he said, and to explain himself, because he was saying that this is questioning: is this a subconscious thing that referees subconsciously favour bigger clubs? He wasn't saying that there was any deliberate move to do down Wolves by match officials, just whether he was just querying, and lots of people have done this before, is there sort of inherent bias towards the bigger clubs, which referees and match officials don't even think about. It's just something that happens, and I think that's a fair enough opinion, question to raise, point of view. I don't think he's not questioning that, saying that somebody is actually biased against or in favour of a particular club.
And then finally, Backpage of The Guardian has some heavy topics here. Alexander Zinchenko talking about the horror of war at home in Ukraine. But Miguel, I want you to break this one down for me. Female players demand FIFA scrap Saudi sponsorship.
Yeah, this is actually, well, it's a theme that's been running for some time, given that at the Club World Cup, sorry, not the Club World Cup, at the Women's World Cup in Australia and New Zealand last year, there was initially an attempt from FIFA to bring in Visit Saudi as a sponsor. Obviously, a lot of the female game is, I mean, it's much more outspoken than the men's game, to their credit. Much more players are much more willing to speak out. And obviously, they're naturally pointing to issues over both women's rights and homosexuality in Saudi Arabia. And they just feel it's completely unconscionable that they can, I suppose, impose this on the women's game, given all these issues. But there are bigger themes here, which is increasingly FIFA President Gianni Infantino has this, I suppose, what is a deepening relationship with the Saudi state, and particularly the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And this all fits into, as well, the uncertainty over the current Club World Cup,
right,
where
Miguel,
the widespread
I am very sorry, we are going to have to wrap you up.
Will bail them out.
Thank you so much for that explanation. Thank you to Martyn Ziegler and to Miguel Delaney. If you missed any of the show, there's another chance to see Backpages tonight at hour. And the show is also available as a podcast. Just download Backpages on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time.